Welcome back, everybody, to the Radical Moderate Podcast. I am your host, Pat O'Brien. And this week, we are going to talk about wars. The reason why I'm bringing this up right now is because the U.S. has currently initiated a war in Iran, and so we're going to talk about that in depth. But war in general, like what is the radical moderate view of war? What are the solutions? What have we not tried? But more than anything, probably is what's the history of it? What's the context? What in modern day war? How does all of this work? What's really possible? And I think where we're going to end up is there are lessons that I think are to be learned. Just not sure that we've actually learned them or that we've taken heed of them. And so that's the impetus for this, is the fact that President Trump on February 28th decided to initiate a war in Iran. How did we get here in general, and what's possible? And will it turn out better than maybe we think that it will, or will it be a big disappointment, which several other wars in recent memory have certainly become? So I want to set the stage by saying, and I wrote this in the book, there are really two types of war, to keep it simple. There are wars of choice and there are wars of necessity. So to understand that idea, that principle a little better, let's just do a quick review going back a little over 100 years. So I'm going to start with World War I. So this was a war, of course, initiated in Europe. It was clear the U.S. was not wanting to get involved with this, but we just kind of had to. But we did not get involved at the beginning, and it wasn't a situation like you're going to have with the bombing of Pearl Harbor decades later. No, this was a war that we kind of only got into late. We were only in it for 19 months. We probably were the reason why it ended at all, is because of our involvement. It was going to become clear that it was going to have to come to an end. As far as wars go, the death toll was, I would say, significant. I mean, any loss of life is significant, but there was about 116,000 Americans that died. From a cost standpoint, though, it was $330 billion in inflation-adjusted money. That is a low number compared to modern-day wars, and certainly what happened in World War II. Like I said, it was 19 months and not much else to say. We really didn't want to be in it. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars. What I think it really became was more the seeds of World War II, and the Germans were very disgruntled by what happened. But the lines of battle, I think, moved less than 20 miles. It was a senseless war, I think, is the way most historians look at it. I would say more so a war of necessity. We had to get involved. It was inevitable that we're going to get involved, and our involvement probably helped finish the war. World War II. So World War II is going to be the benchmark for war. It's clearly a war of necessity. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Germany was going to take over all of Europe, and fascism was going to roll. We had no decision except to be a part of that war. And there's not a credible argument on the other side. Now, I will say American public opinion was not really for it until the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And then immediately everybody got on board. This was a real war. And I say that not to diminish anything that would later happen in other wars, but to say this is the standard of why you actually go to war. Over 400,000, maybe 405,000 Americans died in this war. In today's dollars, it was $4 or $5 trillion. Like, it was incredibly expensive. At one point at the peak, it was 40% of the GDP of the country. And I mean, you can go read your history books about the rationing of gas and food and rubber, war bonds that funded the war. Like, this is completely foreign to somebody really even who was born in 1969 like I was, but certainly if you were born, if you're under 30 years old, you only know about this stuff from your history books. But I want to make two comments about World War II before I move on. The first comment is that there were very clear objectives. we were attacked by the Japanese. There was an alliance between those Axis type powers. We had no choice. So you got that. You got that as the backbone of it. The foundation of it is that we had to defend ourselves, and the objectives were clear. We needed unconditional surrender of Japan. Period. End of story. We had to have unconditional surrender of Germany. Period. End of story. Italy was also, trying to be partners with Germany. That didn't really work out well for them. But I mean, same thing, unconditional surrender of Italy. So I would move on, except I want to say one more thing. I think for a lot of people, there's still an abstractness about World War II because it was so long ago. It's not for me. It really isn't, because my father, Michael Truman O'Brien, served in World War II. He was in the Navy in the South Pacific. He saw battles that he never talked about to me, but I'm sure scarred him for the rest of his life. But this was he and every person who served in that war and all the different fronts and all those who died and the effects that had it. This was a frickin' war that was real and justified, and we had to win, and everybody was a part of it. And the people back home were doing their part to support the war effort abroad. Everybody was united in this goal. And if you're going to have to go to war, that's the way you want to do it. And I think sometimes in modern times, you're people who are making decisions about war are people who don't know anything about it. And while I've never served in the military, and I'm not going to wrap myself in the flag and say that I'm some kind of expert, I will say that the O'Briens did their part. And not just my father, who, by the way, was in Nagasaki 2 weeks after they dropped the bomb. So it doesn't get any more real than that. But all the O'Briens and spouses of O'Briens whose husbands were in the war, like the O'Briens did our part. So I don't take a backseat to anyone when you're like, oh, so you don't believe in defending your country. Screw you. I mean, really, the O'Briens have done our part. And my father fought so that I didn't have to. He fought to defend democracy and freedom. So the O'Briens did our part in the war effort. So anyone who would ever listen to anything that I say and say, we're soft on going to war, that's just total bullshit, really. End of story. So in rant with that. Korea is the next war. They call it the Forgotten War. There were actually over 36,000 deaths of American soldiers. The cost was maybe in today's dollars, $500 billion. We throw numbers around that, around pretty casually. But it was a war that we didn't end up really with much. And so the lasting effects is you got North Korea and South Korea. It's really, I think, a break from the justified nature of World War II. We get involved in Korea. At the end of the day, I don't know that anybody really knows why. And then you come to Vietnam, and Vietnam was a quagmire. To kind of break it down in bullets real quick, there was poor strategic clarity. Why are we there? We kind of inched into the war. Even the way that we finally got in with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution possibly was a made-up reason and just a excuse by the Lyndon Johnson's administration to fully go in. There was a massive long-term cost. 58,000 Americans died in that war, over $1 trillion. And that's, by the way, 300,000 people wounded. I think more, recent generations, there's somebody might be listening to this podcast who fought in Vietnam. Certainly your father might have fought in Vietnam. I think that's more real. I did a semester-long class at the University of Arkansas on this, taught by Dr. Randall Woods, who was kind of one of the authorities in the Vietnam War. And at the end of the day, my takeaway was the Vietnam War was a civil war. It was a civil war. It was not, American interests were not at play. You got to keep in mind the Cold War was going on at that time. And so we thought maybe it was the right thing to do. I think clearly it was a mistake. And I think it leads to a break in trust. And there's a lot of other things that affect that. The Pentagon Papers, which I'm not going to do a deep dive on now, but it also kind of illustrates the reality that after World War II, we in this country had created a military industrial complex. And General Eisenhower, who was then President Eisenhower, and in his outgoing address to the nation, kind of warned us of this military industrial complex. And basically, this what that means is if you have a massive arsenal and you have huge numbers of troops and bases, not just everywhere in the country, which we have had before, but everywhere in the world, when you are holding a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail. And so the proclivity, the incentives, even economic incentives to wage war or use weapons are there. They're very real. And that's why the people who are making the decisions for us, they need to be the most restrained. The justifications to go to war need to be the highest justifications of anything we do. You pass a tax cut or whatever, they got to debate it forever. Everybody's going to go on record. People lose their jobs, etc. It's important. Our tax rates are important. Nothing's more important than a use of force resolution. And I think with Vietnam is where things really started to change. And you've got maybe at least one good example and several bad examples of how we've handled it. To start with, the good example was Gulf War I, which was in 1990 and 1991. Clearly, over 100 plus years, the power of the president as commander in chief has simply expanded as it has expanded into the legislative arena also over that time period. And I think President Trump is pushing the limits of executive authority to the breaking point. And prior to him going to war in Iran, he had shown a lot of restraint, and there had been a lot of political rhetoric of he was the president who would keep us out of wars. But that's all gone. Now he owns this Iran war. But going back to the first Gulf War, you had Bush 1. You had President George Herbert Walker Bush. And this is very interesting, I think, his personal history, which is he was a pilot in World War II for the Navy. He flew combat missions. This guy understood the consequences of war. And so when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Gulf War I was really a war of necessity. We had to do something. We couldn't just let this guy bully around the Middle East without any consequences. And yes, it was about oil. Let's be crystal clear about that, economic incentives. But it was also about just, we're allies with Israel, and that's just the reality of it. I don't love everything that they do by any means. I'm not a fan of Netanyahu really at all, but it is what it is. We could not just let Hussein rule over the Middle East. And so we had to push back. What was brilliant about this, and again, I don't ever want to diminish the loss of an American soldier's life. We only lost 300 soldiers in Gulf War I. Like, that's, as far as wars go, and we're talking about troops on the ground, that is astounding. That is brilliantly pulled off. It was $100 billion in cost. That ain't much as far as wars go. I don't remember how many allied nations were a part of it, but there was scores, maybe as many as 40. Like, everyone agreed this invasion into Kuwait could not stand. And Bush 1 did it the right way, man. He brought the world together. James Baker I believe it's his Secretary of State, brought the world together, and he said, we're going to have a very clear objective. And they kicked the hell out of the Iraqis and knocked them out of Kuwait. And then they did something that was remarkable. They stopped. They did not go to Baghdad. They could have rolled over the Iraqi troops like a hot knife through butter, and they chose not to. And that was so smart, because I think President Bush 1 understood we don't want to occupy this country. We had a war of necessity. Remember, he was born of World War II, a hero, an American hero. He knew that although we had the power to do it, that's not a reason to do it. He was holding a hammer in his hand, and he saw nails in front of him, and he chose not to use that hammer after he eradicated the Iraqis out of Kuwait. Brilliant. Great job. And then comes 9/11. And we know the history there. We know that, we immediately, in response to 9/11, go into Afghanistan. I was absolutely for that war. It was justified. We're trying to get bin Laden, et cetera, et cetera. We did it for the right reasons. And like many things, and perhaps how Iran's going to go, it looked great in the first couple of months. It looked like things were going amazing. And then we stayed for 20 years. Okay. We stayed for literally 20 years at the cost of maybe $2.3 trillion. We lost 2,400 American soldiers during that time period. Again, this isn't like World War II or in Vietnam. And the technology is different. You don't have to have troops in a forward position the way that you did in these other wars, but it's still 2,400 Americans. And you got to ask yourself, like, what did they die for? Because as soon as we left Afghanistan, the country fell apart again. And we know that somewhere maybe 13 or 15 soldiers died under Biden's watch when we were leaving, but we had to leave, and at least now no more Americans are going to die in Afghanistan, and we're not spending any more money there. But Afghanistan at least had proper justification going into it. And then comes Gulf War II, the second entree into Iraq. The short of it is, it was bad. $2 to $3 trillion in spending, 4,500 U.S. deaths. But more than anything, what did we accomplish? It went on forever. It probably cost Hillary Clinton the presidency in 2016 because of her vote on it. The war on terror, folks, is a lot like the war on drugs. Like it just didn't work. And I think that it's an example of, just because you have the military might doesn't mean that you should use it. And if you're trying to fight or kind of get rid of radical Islam, you're not going to do it through military might. You're just, not to say that you should let people do whatever they want. It's got to be a war of necessity. And the war on terror started out as a war of necessity, and it ended up as a war of choice and forever war. And we don't have much to show for it. The hope was we'd learn some lessons along the way. So let me transition now to what should we be doing? What is the radical moderates' view on all this? Well, a couple of things. And really, World War II is that benchmark. That's like the best way to understand what a war should be. Congress should have involvement. There is a War Powers Act, and it came out of Vietnam in, I believe, 1973. It's never been used effectively. I'm not even sure how many times they've tried to use it. It's been an ineffective tool. Congress should be much more involved. They clearly have the power to declare war, and that's what Roosevelt did in World War II. And of course, they were all going to vote for it. But Congress should have a role, because we have too much power in the president. And it doesn't matter if it's a Bush, a Clinton, an Obama, or a Trump. The president has too much ability to wage war, especially like forever wars. We need to fund the war. And this goes back to a basic radical moderate principle of there's no free lunch. So everything has a cost. And I think, to keep it simple, wars should be part of your tax bill. Like, it should be broken down, and maybe everything should. Here's how much you pay for Social Security. Here's how much you pay for the National Endowment of the Arts. But war is something that should be, the lead up to the war and the costs of the war should be transparent, and we should have to pay for the war with real money, like a burden to the public, so that it's seen and understood, and we can hold ourselves accountable for it. And the other thing is, there needs to be some type of draft for wars. Now, to me, this is the real dichotomy here. I think the Vietnam War probably eventually ended because people were like, this draft stuff is ridiculous. I'm not doing it. And we get away from the draft. We get into a voluntary military. And look, you sign up for the military, you know what can happen. You know you can be in a forward position. You know you can die for your country. I choose not to do that. I would have done it in World War II. I would have had to, but I was of age in Gulf War I, and I said to myself, I was in college. I said to myself, I'll go if we needed. Well, I didn't know anything about anything. The thing was over before, you could blink because it was masterfully executed. But there has to be, everybody's got to share in the pain if you're going to really be at war. And that's why, quite frankly, we really haven't been in a true war since World War II. They call Vietnam a war, and we were there, and the troops on the ground, and a lot of people died. But it wasn't truly a war in this. I mean, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is the only resolution that says we're going to be there, that Congress put forward. We didn't really have a true war resolution. We don't do that anymore, and we should. And under the way the Constitution is currently constructed, I don't know that anything's going to change. I'm just throwing out some ideas that Congress should have an actual role in this, and it's much more than it is currently. We should fund these wars transparently, and we should share in the pain. We should have some type of draft system, even if it's a limited draft system, so that everybody has to participate. And then we'd have a much more robust debate of whether or not we should be involved in these things at all. So let's talk now about the war in Iran. And I talked about this last week, so I'm not going to cover all of that same ground, but I want to start with the concept of, in the context of war in general, was this a good idea? Is it going to work, etc.? So the first thing I want to say is we tend to underestimate the cost of war. I think we did that for sure in Iraq and Afghanistan. Billions, is the initial estimate of what it's going to cost. And then over time, that just becomes trillions. Okay. So we underestimate the costs. We underestimate casualties and deaths, but more so we underestimate the monetary cost because these things get expensive. And the first year of the war is always the least expensive. And then you got to think about the fact when people are wounded, when people are losing arms and legs, they're going to be in the Veterans Administration hospitals for the rest of their life. Forget about their quality of life, it's horrendous for them. But the care and the money that we're going to have to spend just simply because we decided to make war on somebody in any given war, there's a huge cost and it's got a long tail to it. We also overestimate our control of the situation. Now, in Iran specifically, I think the thing that is on the news and that we can all appreciate is the Strait of Hormuz. You've got 20% of the global oil supply going through that one narrow area. And I think there's certain areas where it's only 20 miles wide. So, and it butts to Iran. So Iran has tremendous authority, tremendous, they're in the region and can do quite a bit to stymie or even completely stop the flow of oil. Now, President Trump made a presidential address on April 1st, and with his rhetorical style, he said things like, we've completely wiped out the Iranian Navy and taken away their capacity, et cetera, et cetera. He made it all sound pretty peachy keen. I don't think that's probably as true as he's making it sound, but they're still going to have some missiles. They're still going to have drones. It's like living in a very high crime area. You can roll out the National Guard for a period of time, but then the criminals are just going to hide for a while. And then when the National Guard leaves, they're going to come back out. It's not going to change the overall situation. So we have an oil shock. We know that price per barrel is going to go up over 100 and probably stay there. We know that the price at the pump is going to go up. I said before, that doesn't affect my life that much, but it affects a lot of people's lives tremendously. But it is what it is. It's the price that we pay, and we know that there are risk factors involved. But I just think we're overestimating our control. And quite frankly, I don't know that there was a good plan. I said that President Trump, I think, was just making a very large gamble by going to Iran. It's his gamble to make. I mean, whether he did it the way he did it, which was no real justification ahead of time, and waiting 32 days to give his real first substantive presidential address, we knew he could do this if he wanted. He could have gone to Congress. He didn't, but he could have gone to Congress. The Republicans would have said, oh, sure, President Trump, whatever you want to do. They weren't gonna go against him. It's just the American people would have had more understanding of the justification. But at the end of the day, I think that it's kind of a fool's errand if we think that this is going to be simple or easy. And I will say it was interesting in that address on April 1st that the president made. He talked about several other wars and how long they were. And then he made the comment, we're only 32 days into Iran. If he pulls out of it now, he could argue that it was to stymie Iran's nuclear ambitions and that it worked. He could really declare victory and then just walk away from Iran for the rest of his presidency. And that's probably, quite frankly, that's probably the smart move. The smart move politically for him, but also probably the smart move for us. If he goes into Iran with ground troops, whether that's to get uranium that's under a bunch of rubble, or even more ambitious, he tries to go to Tehran and take out the leadership. It's something akin to what he did in Venezuela, which, by the way, Iran and Venezuela are just not comparable situations in any regard. But if he were to do that, I think it's going to go really badly. And I've told people, I don't think he will, but if he does, he's 100% made this a war of choice. Currently, the way it stands right now in April of 2026, I think President Trump could argue this was a necessity. They were going to get the bomb. He's saying they were weeks away. I think Netanyahu in Israel has been saying that for like 40 years. So it's not believable. It's the Chicken Little, the boy who cried wolf type scenario. But let's say that Iran ultimately was always going to try to get nukes. Then that's at least a justification because it's different, right? This isn't World War I or World War II where we have an ocean between us and Germany had no capacity to hit us. This is different. Nuclear bombs, if you put them into an intercontinental ballistic missile, can go anywhere in the world. Now, I don't know that Iran has that. I don't think Iran has that type of technology, but they have drones, and they could also, there's the scenario of they could smuggle a nuke into the United States by boat somehow, and somebody could detonate it in Manhattan. I mean, there's been movies made about this. I don't think any of that was going to happen. I don't, but I don't have national security briefings. We're stuck with having to just trust the president of the United States, whoever that person may be. It just happens to be President Trump at the moment. So here's the thing. Iran war is dominating the headlines right now, but history is going to tell us that the real story of a war is rarely written within the first few months. The question isn't whether the war is justified, because that is ambiguous at this moment. It really is. I'm not going to be reactionary and say that there's no justification for the war, because there are some. I'm not convinced at all, but there are justifications to be had. The real question, I would say, it's whether we've learned anything from the last 100 years of war, right? We have test cases. We have a history here. And folks, if we're not going to do anything else, let's learn from our history, right? Anyone listening to this podcast, unless they work in the White House or what's now called the Department of War, everyone else who listens to this podcast, we don't have authority to stop President Trump from waging a war in Iran. We don't. That was decided in November of 2024 when he was elected president of the United States. He has that authority, and the Congress could step in. They're not going to. I don't think anything is going to change in the executive authority of President Trump, at least until January of 2027. And that's only if a Democrats get a majority, at least in the House, possibly in the Senate. So we're stuck with it. He's a commander in chief. I support the office of the presidency. I support our troops. I'm highly concerned that this war in Iran was kind of reckless, that the justifications were super weak. The American public's not behind it. But the bigger lesson here is, can we at least recognize our history and the contextual, put Iran into the context of what we've learned for the last 100 years? If we could do that, if we could just do that one thing, I think that would honor people like my father who fought in wars so that other people didn't have to fight in wars. Folks, I appreciate you listening for this week. That is the POV of POB.